Hi, everyone. Thank you, Zach. It's been a long conversation, and I'm very happy to finally be here. It's a pleasure to be on this campus. It's a pleasure to be speaking to all of you. I know a peculiar thing about this room, which is that the exit is behind me. So if any of you guys tries to leave, I'll know it. But hopefully I'll not take too long. Just a little bit about ourselves, very briefly. Herzog DeMeuron is a company that was founded in, I believe, 1978 by Jacques Herzog and Pierre DeMeuron in Basel, Switzerland, which is where we are headquartered. We're a company of around 500 people. And we're very fortunate to have an office here in San Francisco with a great team, many of whom are here as well. And so it's over the years become an international practice, which has, I think, around 45 nationalities that are working in the office and contributing to our company. I start with this slide because this is the entry to our office in Basel. And for those of you who have a keen eye, you might recognize where this entry comes from. This is actually a mock-up for the de Young Museum here in San Francisco. So we are very close. We're very connected to San Francisco. The Bay Area is where our first project in the United States was built. That was Napa Valley. That was the Dominus Winery. So it's a very long relationship that we have with the area, with the community here, and one that we're very happy to continue to see grow. Composition is an interesting point of departure. I thought that was nice to see a kind of consistent theme for all of the lectures, although I'm sure everybody has a different way of approaching it. To be honest, it's not a word that we use so much in our practice. I did a quick search looking at the texts for our company for all of the different writings about projects, of which there are more than 600, and I think I found 15 references to the word composition, which is not to say it's not very important or instrumental in the way we do our work. It is, we just probably think of it in a different way. We often talk about ingredients in our work and think about how those ingredients come together. So that's another form of composition. I start with this project because it was the first project that I worked on. It was a very lucky start for me in 2005 when I graduated from Harvard. I didn't actually know how lucky I would be. This was a project where I had an amazing opportunity to start a project on the day that it started, and I finished it. I oversaw construction, lived in Miami. I had an incredible mentor who was the partner for that project, Christine Binswanger, who has continued to be just an enormous force in our company. And I saw a project through despite a financial crash in 2008, when something like this should have been very improbable. Yet there it is. It's a parking garage, or it could be seen as a parking garage. It's actually really an urban project with retail and programs distributed throughout it. The reason why I started is because I know that there are some of you who are students, and I thought it would be interesting just to relay my experience on this project, because the day that I started was actually the summer party in our office. It's a very social event, and Pierre DeMeuron came up behind me and he said, keep in mind, I had just moved from Boston. I had moved my whole life to Basel, and he said, I have this great project for you. It's a parking garage in Miami. And it was really a shock. I had gone to Switzerland thinking I would get to work on projects like the Tate Modern, which had been completed, or this is another picture from the Tate Modern of the Turbine Hall there, which is an incredible public space that was really important, remains important for us as a company, but certainly for those of us who were students at the time. The Beijing Olympic Stadium was well underway. This also would have been an attractive project to work on at the time. The de Young Museum was pretty fantastic. I think it was just opening or was nearing completion when I started. And then there was the parking garage in Miami. And I have to say, I left, and that next day, which was my second day in Basel, I went walking around and trying to figure out like really how I felt about this project. And I came across this. I was standing on that bridge that you can see in the background there, and I looked up at it, and this is a signal box that is really an industrial piece of architecture, a piece of infrastructure, clad in copper, opened up to allow some views for a few of the offices inside and ventilation for the equipment behind, and ultimately to protect that equipment. It's just a signal box. And I thought, okay, well, that could be a good basis for me to start thinking about a parking garage. And of course, it wasn't just me, it was part of a team, but it certainly was inspiring. And so just briefly to talk about this project, this was the extension of Lincoln Road. At the time, there was just this empty plot at the end, and there was a kind of a termination, an abrupt termination of the pedestrian area. What we were confronted with was a planning envelope that was 75 feet tall next to an existing building. This was the SunTrust Bank building, a kind of nice brutalist building that sat next to it. There was a certain amount of area, a limited amount of area we could work with. And so we started thinking, how could we deal with this? We saw this picture of the old Ford Theater, I believe it was the Ford Theater in Detroit. And that was somehow inspiring. The idea that you could park in this amazing space. This was never obviously intended to be a parking lot, but this amazing space, and that it could be something more than just a parking lot just by adding air. And so we thought about using the ceiling, using a ceiling as the facade of the project, and adding air and space and bringing ramps through it. So these were just some very early models. This was an early model where we introduced this idea of these elevated slabs, basically taking exactly the same amount of area that we were allowed to have, but just extending it up, adding air to it, and ultimately making the facade the slab which you see from below. Then there was the question of how this comes together, and it's a parking garage, so it's very simple. You really just work with a composition of slabs and columns and ramps. This was a sketch from Jacques Herzog at the time, this idea of the slabs just moving, shifting side to side, the columns following as the ramp moved through it. And so it was just a very kind of basic analytical process where we started with this idea of the slab shifting, and then we added the drive aisles that were required. And this is an early version, so it doesn't correspond exactly with what it wound up being. With that, we defined the kind of envelope, the maximum area of the columns that could go up. Those were the bottom forms. We started slicing them according to the number of parking spots, and then started looking for opportunities through different rotations, and this was the kind of maximum form. At that point, it was a little bit about composition and finding a way to make something beautiful out of that space, working within defined parameters with a very, very select set of elements in order to create the form that gives expression to the project. Here you can see the final version. Obviously, it became more rational over time, but it still simply reaches out to catch the slabs, cuts back in when the slabs move in, becomes a kind of V when you have multiple layers below it, giving expression to the overall project. There are very few details in this project. In fact, the most difficult thing about this project was to make the sprinklers go away. And there you can see the sprinklers. It's very unusual in America to have them basically embedded in the concrete. And so we had to come up with this detail where the outside edge basically could snap off easily if they had to repair it, and then slide the sprinkler pipes in from the outside and work with the fire department to get this approved. After that, it was just a matter of lamps and really composing a few elements. Of course, the guardrail was important, being as thin as possible in a thin concrete post-tension slab. As you go up, you can see there is actually a penthouse at the top, which is this space. So a kind of garden, almost a case study like house that sits at the top of the building. So the next project is Calder Gardens, which is a current project that we're doing in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. Downtown is down here. And you can see this is the Parkway, which has the Philadelphia Museum of Art at the end of it. It has the Barnes right across the way, the Rodin, just an incredible collection of museums and a very special but almost kind of 19th century, or early 20th century boulevard cutting through the city. The project is a very small, we wouldn't call it a museum. It's called Calder Gardens because it's a space for Calder's work. It's a combination of the Calder Foundation, which is Calder's grandson, and the Barnes Museum, who manages it. And it's just there for Calder's work, not just the Calder that most of us know, but also his predecessors who were from Philadelphia. Very few pieces. It's about 17,000 square feet, so a tiny project compared to what we typically would do in our office, I would say, but very special. So it's a totally different thing than 1111 Lincoln Road. Jacques, when the project, when 1111 Lincoln Road came out, he famously said that that project was all muscle and no clothes, which seemed very appropriate for Miami. This is not that. This is a project which you will never understand in a way in its entirety. This is the current construction site right now, and it's probably the clearest that you will see the plan, because this will all be buried in the end. The question was what to do on this site, a very difficult site that sits across from the Barnes and on the Parkway, but is actually squeezed between the highway on the backside here, which is a kind of cut through the city, and the Parkway here with very little access to it. The Parkway is a major civic space, and the highway, the Vine Street Expressway, is a place which has almost no connection to the site. And so it's this place that is just kind of squeezed in between. And so as we started the project, we tried to understand what we could do there. We knew that in this place where you have such incredible monumental projects, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Barnes itself, which is an absolutely incredible institution, the Rodin, that we didn't want to do something that would compete with those projects. We didn't need to add something else, a big statement on the site. It has an incredible green space in the city, and so we knew that we wanted to work with that green space. And then, of course, there's Calder's work, which is incredibly varied, and also something kind of work with a kind of form that we didn't want to compete with. We wanted to make a backdrop for his work, whether it's mobiles or stabiles or works on paper, that had the same kind of variety in it that Calder's work itself was meant to be shown in. You see them in museums, you see them in urban spaces, you see them in landscapes. Each of those kinds of environments creates a different relationship with the work. So we went through this process, a lot of different options in the beginning, trying to understand sort of a pavilion-like structure, something that was maybe like 1111 Lincoln Road, elevated, that would give views over the city. This here, where we started to explore digging in, and a big wall that would address the highway onto it. And then we arrived at this idea, very simple, which is that the project would be this composition of the wall, the disc, gardens, the wall, the gardens, the disc. So the wall frames the space. It's a backdrop. You have the Parkway at the bottom here. The wall bends in and embraces the site. It protects the site from the sound of the space. It's a form which is only seen from the front as a kind of stainless steel panel in a way that extends out, that provides a backdrop to a garden, which is Pete Eldoff's design in the front. So as you walk up, this is what you see. The disc, where you come to as you walk in, is the first space. It's a kind of, not a plaza, but just a small entry area, which is also a roof to the galleries below. And so it's only there as you come up to it that you understand that there is actually more down below. The galleries are all underground. They all have different characters and forms, which I will show in a bit. Two gardens bring light into the galleries. it was important for us to be able to situate Calder's work in the landscape, to bring this connection to the landscape despite being underground. There were a lot of concerns doing a public project on the parkway in an area where there are safety concerns, security concerns, homelessness, a lot of issues that would make it very difficult for Calder's work itself to be displayed out in the open. And so this idea of creating landscape below that would be closed off gave a means of both bringing variety to the space and light to the space, but also a different kind of landscape environment for the projects around it. The sunken garden itself, a small space for one piece of work, and the vestige garden, as it's called, facing the west, which takes its form from the city plan, from the buildings that in a way we imagined being on the site. We hadn't been able to dig in, so we imagined that there were ruins in the site. And so we looked to the kind of site outlines to create this form. We went through a lot of studies and we wound up with this space, which has this kind of walls that are almost like the foundations of buildings defining the space below ground. The project is only ever experienced on a step-by-step way. You come in, you see one part, then you move a bit more, you see the next. You start with the garden, you come to the entry, just like a fold lifting up on the wall, which then exposes a window looking down into the gallery. You move to the right, where you come into this lobby area, very small space. It's not intended to be for many people at one time, with a window looking over the garden. You then start to descend down to what we call the highway gallery, a space which has steps coming down where a group of school kids could gather, with a view on the left over the highway. So the highway, which is a kind of back to the site, becomes a focal point for the space. That's now on the right there. You then see the space below opening up below you, where you would have the mobiles hanging above you and some of Calder's work as they choose, and there will be a rotating exhibit below. You come down what we call the cuboid stair inside the space, a very kind of carved out stair that takes you down into the underground area, into the tall gallery, which is that space you saw a moment ago, which is a high space allowing for some of Calder's larger works to be situated. You come from there into the open plan gallery, a space which is framed on both sides by the gardens. So you have a garden on the right, this kind of beam which extends across and divides the space, connecting it to the wall up above, and then the garden on the left, which is visible just through a slot in the wall. This is looking out at the garden. From there, you see the sunken garden as you walk in. You come around to the curved gallery, which is a dark space. There are a lot of works on paper. You need a controlled space. So this is an area which is then very much controlled in terms of the daylight that comes in, with the garden as a kind of drum in the center of it. You go out. Now we're walking following this line, and you come to this little space, which is an extension of the open plan gallery. This is the apps gallery. Again, another kind of space, almost like a photographer's studio with without definition on the sides, where Calder's work can be seen in a very kind of abstract environment. And from there, we move outside again to the vestige garden. Looking from the back, here you can see the construction as it's happening right now. We're sitting below, of course, because they have to bring the landscape in. And finally, to what we call the quasi-gallery, a space that's called the quasi-gallery because there was an intention to have an outdoor exhibition space that was covered, and a kind of dark space, almost a cave-like space. So that project should be open next year. We're very excited about it. It's although small, very significant for us. Next category of work is built on built. These are projects that we have done which are a response to existing conditions. Something that from the beginning, as with Tate, as you see, working within existing has always been something that we believe in. From a sustainability perspective, we've always thought it's important to try to work with what is there before we try to do something new. And so it's something that we've done in the past. This is the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg, which sits on an old warehouse space with a new new building above that has the symphony hall in it, and the kind of public space at the center. Caixa Forum in Madrid, a museum that also creates an urban plaza in front of it with a new building sitting on the old. Kuppersmühle, which is a two-part project as well, a renovation of the old and then a new building that sits on the end. Recently completed Powerhouse Arts in Brooklyn, an old power station on the right-hand side with a new building on the left that makes a community art space, kind of, you could call it sort of maker space, that also creates a public venue working within that existing structure. And now under construction, Amherst College Student Center and Dining Commons, a project which for Amherst College, I guess for some of you, you might be familiar with it. I assume maybe it's even a rival school in some ways, a school that has an incredible academic tradition, but realize that in this day and age, students were struggling because of lack of social interaction. And so they really wanted to focus on making a student space that brought people together. Sustainability was also extremely important to them. They didn't want to conform to particular standards, but they have a very ambitious program for the entire college, which I know Stanford is really leading on this. So I think there are some parallels of it, perhaps maybe you're ahead. And so we created this project, which sits on the foundations of an existing building. This is actually the current construction site, where we wanted to create a new building that sat on the concrete base. So this new timber construction with a student center that sits on the existing structure, which will then house a dining hall below. Without looking at furniture or anything like that, it's a very simple combination of the existing structure, which is cut off, with mass timber construction on top. The form itself of these pieces, which you can see here being mocked up, allows for the lack of or the imprecise nature of the existing structure, so that these columns, which we couldn't map out precisely, could be slightly off. And so this existing structure will carry the weight and can shift on top of those existing columns. Part of the building sits within that existing structure. And for students, that was interesting because it is the kind of space that they wanted. Amherst itself is situated in Western Massachusetts. It's a kind of rural environment. And the college itself, it feels like it is also competing against city universities and colleges. So they wanted to make a space that felt urban in a way. And yet it also has this very refined character of the new on top, creating a wide variety of different uses above it. Finally, the view from below, where the new on top sits on the old below. Closer to San Francisco, the power station, which is an ongoing project in the dog patch in San Francisco on the bay. When the developer first approached us, they had a master plan, quite a large master plan. From memory, I think it's around 5 million square feet that they're able to build there. They came to us with the first 3 buildings. Now we've added a 4th, which is on the right-hand side. And we were pretty skeptical, I have to say. That amount of volume in the city was something that we were not sure about. We were looking at it from far away. And then we visited and we saw this site, the proximity to the water, and we understood what that was. And we understood the potential of these existing buildings to really give character to the city. And so we said, yes, we'll do it, on the condition that we actually picked those first 3 blocks because they frame the public space, they shape the public space. And while it is developing, we also wanted to make sure that we could have a role in the way the public space was made. And so we started with the adaptive reuse of Station A, this incredible building that sits in front. We started with the turbine hall, a long space in the center, which is not so dissimilar in scale, actually, from the turbine hall in the Tate Modern, which is here. But what makes it really different is that it has these incredible turbine foundations. They're really beautiful. I mean, they're sculptures in and of themselves, but they are entirely built for purpose to hold these massive structures up above and take the vibrations and deal with all the earthquakes and everything like that. And so we started thinking, how could we make something that reacted to these? How could we utilize these in this existing building? We started with those existing structures, and we thought, actually, those were intended to take a huge amount of weight. So why don't we use those, extending upwards from them, not to take all of the load that comes down, but to take the lateral load to help stabilize the building, therefore reducing the amount of demolition, but also reducing the amount of concrete that would go into this project. And so we extended them up, just kind of V, to hold the building up above. And then, of course, the existing structure would also have to be reinforced, and that would take the load. This is a section of the turbine hall where you can see these old structures down below in combination with the new up above, making different kinds of spaces. Ultimately, this will be a company that will go in here. How public they make it, I think, is a conversation for that company, not for us, but it is nonetheless a public space inside that company where people can gather from that company. This is looking at that space, looking at the existing, looking at what it will become. Sometimes it's a little sad to clean it up, but not all the graffiti is so nice. Again, looking from the side, looking at the kind of space that we would make, a cafe situated in there. Looking at the entry from the inside with another one of these structural pieces. And finally, looking from the outside. The incredible thing about this project, as we saw it, is it is surprisingly beautiful for what it is. This existing structure, we didn't need to do much. We often try to create these kind of random patterns, but here every opening came because there was a piece of equipment, a pipe going through the wall, and those were in a way a gift, even the patina on the project. And so all we had to do was work with those openings, creating sealing them off, and then creating one opening towards the park. The upper volume was another exercise, and this was an early sketch. We knew if we wanted to be to work with that existing structure and to be sustainable, it had to be something lightweight. And so we started looking at the historic references around and thought we could work with steel, making a steel structure that would sit up above, that would sit on top of these existing buildings, providing the office spaces up above. And so we looked at the roof, and we looked at how that could inform the kind of architecture up above. Of course, we needed to provide shading. These also then would have solar panels integrated on them, which leave views open to the city around it. The views from there are incredible over the bay, but offer the shading that allows that glass to function thermally. The roof itself has a kind of form that belongs to this architecture. This pitched roof is opened up on one side here, creating a communal space up above, looking out over the water. Finally, you can see what it looks like. And here it is now. The whole site has been cleared. This is already several months old, but the old building has been reinforced, and the other sites are now all being cleaned. There's a big remediation process that could happen, and now we've actually started a fourth project, which is working just on the right-hand side, that will be a clinic for UCSF. So complexity and beauty. This is another topic, another category. And it starts with this building, which is a rehabilitation clinic that was built more than 20 years ago in Basel. It's for people who have neurological injuries, need rehabilitation. They're often there for quite a long time. It's a project which was a competition that we won. We had never done anything in healthcare, and it was a client who was brave to let us work with them to create a different kind of space within the healthcare environment. That project is an incredible success in the sense that people who work there love to work there. Importantly, you can see actually that there is lower turnover rate. Patients are extremely happy. We've had people from our own office who've been in serious accidents who've been there. And so it's a project which maybe small, but for us is very important. And it became a vehicle into the healthcare world where we saw enormous opportunity. Hospitals are not easy. And so this comes to the complexity part. Hospitals are enormously difficult, but we also know that there are spaces that need attention, spaces where people are working under very stressful conditions and where people are entering under very stressful conditions. And so there actually is a real potential. We started off by asking ourselves, why does a hospital need to look and feel so institutional? We know that it is a machine. We know that everything has to work perfectly. Time is hugely important in a hospital. And so it is crucial that everything is in the right place. And so we had a lot to learn about in that sense. But ultimately, it is for people. It has to have the same qualities that other buildings have to have. It should have. It should have good light. It should have good spatial conditions, good orientation. It should have nice materials, working within the constraints of a hospital. These are pictures from rehab. These are places to heal. We know that people do better in the end when they're in a good environment. Here, this is kind of remarkable because people are staying for quite a while and many people are paralyzed when they come in. The ceiling, first of all, is very important. The second thing is that there is a belief that every patient should have access to the outdoors. And so these doors can open and the balconies are big enough for the bed to be wheeled outside so that even a person who's paralyzed can still have the benefit of that exposure to nature. This is a garden, a courtyard inside. This is the idea that beauty is important in these spaces as well. And finally, a skylight on the project, which is what you see from the bed. So you look up and there's this kind of glow, which brings light in, has a shield in it, but it gives a view for every patient looking up to the sky. And at night, it lights up, it becomes a light in the room, but also this kind of beacon or sign to the outside. The thing is, we know, and these are studies that have been done, this is going back to 1984, a study that was done by Roger Ulrich, where he said that a view through a window may influence recovery from surgery. There is evidence that a good environment is important for a person's healing. So that takes us to Denmark, the new Nordsjælland Hospital, which is a competition that we participated in and won in 2013. It's a large hospital, about 1.2 million square feet. So a very significant project, which was part of a national campaign to redo all of the major hospitals in the country, basically at once. There were competitions that went out. These were the other winning entries for the other projects. You can see they all kind of look the same. And our client at the time, and it's interesting because it is a national program, but they have project directors who have some say that he had the benefit of seeing this and he said, I don't want that. That's repeating the kind of hospital that we have from the past. We want to do something different. And so he opened up the competition and created a brief, a really amazing brief that was very broad and open in terms of the architecture that it invited. And this is our project, which we won with. So the project sits, you can see here, in a very rural setting, going back to where it is. It's just outside Copenhagen to the north. It's a suburb of the city. And it sits outside of that city in an area that will be developed in the future. It sits next to a forest. It's in a town which is very low in scale. And so putting 1.2 million square feet all at once in a place like this was a very sensitive topic for people. It sits in this kind of rolling landscape, very gentle farm fields. And so again, scale was important. And so we understood that we needed to make something that fit, that was approachable despite its size, that was a place that people will feel comfortable in, but it also wouldn't impose itself as you came up to it from the landscape. Many people bike there, they come through the forest, etc. So the first idea was to say, we wanted every patient room, of which there are about 600, to have a view to nature. And we put it very simply in a square, double-loaded corridor, 2 floors to keep it low. And then we had a big garden in the center and then views to the outside. And that ended up being this giant block. It's about 350 meters across, if you can imagine. The biggest problem with that is not just the way it feels, but it's the fact that actually, in terms of circulation, it's very difficult. The main elevator cores would be very far apart and time is very crucial. And so we took those main elevator cores and we pushed them into the center. And so we wanted these short internal connections. And that brought everything, the most intense aspects of the project in towards the center. And that's what ultimately created this form. The building is a single horizontal building. That's important because the client understood that in the past, if we look at those other projects, they tend to be very segmented in these huge hospitals, and especially in Scandinavia, where departments end up having their own kind of kingdom, as it was called. And that made those hospitals inflexible. And so they wanted to create a hospital that was totally flexible, where there wasn't ownership over a single area. And whereas medical advances would change the field, the hospital itself could change. So it was just about creating this kind of flexible, horizontal, single building. The idea was that it would be connected to the landscape, that every part of it would have a view over the landscape, certainly the patient spaces to the outside, but also actually the working areas inside. And Denmark has very strict rules about daylight requirements for all the working areas, so I'll show you that. With this gentle form, as you come up to the project, the project, interestingly enough, gets smaller because you kind of come into this enclosed space. And then suddenly it doesn't feel like such a massive plate surrounding you. And so I had an interesting experience building this, because when it first went into construction, I was sitting there and as a team, we were looking at it, and you could see the foundations going off 350 meters across. And I thought, oh my goodness, what have we done? And it was an interesting thing, because as the project grew and came out of the ground, it actually started to feel smaller and smaller, and gave more of a kind of personal enclosed space. The idea was to have 2 floors on the top. In Denmark, they call them wards, bed wards. Here we call them patient floors, patient rooms. On top of a table, which has the garden on top of it, and then 2 floors of treatment. So the floor right underneath the garden is where you have the outpatient clinics, therapies, dialysis, canteen, also offices, and the under, which is right above the technical spaces, is where you have all of the most intensive parts of the program, the ICU, the intensive care, imaging, surgery, etc. The building, as you come up to it, appears like a low wood building. The fact that it's 2 floors and 2 floors also helps to reduce the scale, and then the landscape ramps up and comes in to this floor right below the garden. It's big. It's actually like a city in the end. It's about 5,000 rooms. It functions like a city, and we think of it that way. It should have the life of a city. It has internal streets. There, they have on patient. You have on stage and off stage. So there's the public streets where patients would walk down, the doctors, and then parallel to it, so that if a patient is in a bed, they don't have to be exposed. You have the off stage, which are kind of like service roads that come through, where all of the equipment can be moved through. Everybody comes into the center, coming predominantly from 2 sides, being brought right into the center of the project, where you have this lobby that then reaches out to those 4 primary elevator cores. From here, as you come in, you are surrounded by landscape. So you have this kind of low pavilion-like structure that connects you to the landscape around, has part of the garden from up above folding down to it, and then it has the 4 wings which take you to the elevator cores. This is it under construction, so you can see the spaces coming along right now. Actually, now the glass is in, so you can really feel what that will be like. There are courtyards everywhere. As I mentioned, in Denmark, the luxury there is not so much that the detailing is incredible in the hospital, it's that because of the requirements that they have, every room has to have daylight, and that creates a certain amount of light and air in the project. Interestingly enough, even the surgical theaters have to have light, and it's not for the surgeons. It's because people spend more time cleaning the surgical theater for hygiene purposes than they do operating in it. And it's for those people who are cleaning the spaces that they need daylight. So in that sense, we were given a lot for free. We had to do these things. So it was about trying to shape that. Those courtyards give orientation. They change, of course, with the light. These are now just examples of the inner courtyards, these kind of rectangular spaces, which offer light to all of the spaces in the center. And then finally, we go up to the patient floors, where you have this large central garden, a garden that people can walk out onto. They want to encourage walking for the patients. They believe that patients should get out of bed to heal as quickly as possible and get outside. And so this becomes a space which can be shared, used by the staff, used by the patients, all of which, of course, has to respect the privacy of the rooms. So we work with the kind of planting in order to make sure that people are kept away from the rooms. This is kind of a foggy shot, but it gives you a sense of what that space feels like right now. It's a very special space, I have to say, because it's unusual. There's 2 floors to stand in the center and have this kind of garden wrapped around you, this sort of low pavilion wrapping around you, but it's also a very significant space. So it's really a kind of park in the project. These are the public areas when you come up from the lobby, and you have the reception desks, the hallways where people are, again, encouraged to go outside. And finally, the patient room, all of which are quite small, but they're single patient rooms, and they all have a balcony to the outside. This is a mock-up of what that balcony will be. And finally, what you see as you come up, where you can see these balconies that help, again, break down the scale, giving the sense of identity to each of the rooms to the outside. So as you approach it as a patient, you see, in a way, the spaces that you may be in, and a view from the top. So, last project, and I'm actually a little faster than I expected, because I didn't actually. This project is certainly our most significant project in the U.S. Just had the groundbreaking a month ago, which is great. It's a project that sits on, you can see that's Golden Gate Park, you guys know the site. So up against Parnassus, it's on the UCSF Parnassus campus. It's an incredibly difficult site. This project was enormously challenging, is enormously challenging to build. It is situated between Mount Sutro, this hill that comes down, and the existing hospital, which has to remain operational while they build this building. It's around 900,000 square feet, which has to go in this very small site. You have very few access ways to get up to it. And in the beginning, there were also real discussions with the neighbors, which are mostly low scale. And so that was one of the issues that drove us. And so from the beginning, we worked in a very collaborative environment, working with all of the builders, with our partner architects, which we always work with. That was HDR, and all of the engineers, everybody from day one, essentially collaborating to figure out how to do this project. And it, in a way, is unlike anything I've seen. It was a design process where at times we would have something like 400 people on a Zoom call talking about design. So, but with all of that complexity, it was there for a reason, because it is just an incredible puzzle to figure out. And so we started that project, and we had to, again, come and think about where this was and what the missing opportunity was. And this is the College of Dentistry, Medicine, and Pharmacy from UCSF, going back to 1891. It was situated on the hill in Mount Sutro. These were the early buildings to view up from Golden Gate Park. And this is what it became. And so somehow this disconnection from nature that happened, we understood with this mountain of buildings, this incredibly dense campus where so many amazing things in terms of research has happened, that it was missing this opportunity. And that also came from the brief to connect the landscape around it, the park below it, certainly visually, and the landscape up above it. It's also important to say that this is a project that, in addition to having the support of UCSF, had amazing support of the Helen Diller Foundation of Jackie Safir, who was just instrumental as well in establishing priorities for the project, for the brief, in terms of the experience. So it really was a project where we worked very, very closely with the organization and with her organization. We started with this question of what did we do? This huge block sitting on the corner, sitting adjacent to a landscape that was beautiful, but wasn't really taken advantage of. And so there was this very early sketch from the beginning where we said we should find a way to take the scale of the neighborhood in to the city to activate the street, which right now is not a particularly active or nice space, and take the landscape into the building to connect the mountain behind, or this experience of landscape, to the hospital. there was no getting around the amount of area that's in there. It had to function, and there are strict height limits. And so we started with this block. We then divided it up essentially in different layers. This is actually early now, so it's not totally accurate. But in the beginning, we thought there would be diagnostic and treatment, then ICU, and then ACU. In the end, that central band is different now. It also has mechanical and so forth in it. But nonetheless, this idea of bringing landscape in became important. And so we took this central layer and we pulled it in, bringing a terrace, what we call the sutra terrace, to help divide up the building. Then we introduced the slabs on the outside, these step slabs, which were important to help bring down the scale of the building. For neighbors around it, they were very concerned about being faced with a giant glass wall. And so we wanted to add articulation that in a way felt more in keeping with the scale of the buildings around it, even if the project itself is much larger. We did a lot of iterations, working endlessly, trying to find ways to squeeze this in. But we maintained this idea of the landscape coming through and this articulation with these slabs that extend out, both offering shading to the rooms, but also helping to shield this from the neighbors. The Sutra Terrace itself carries the landscape in. Here, a space with dining at the bottom of it that you can walk around, so staff can connect over to it. This will connect to all the adjacent buildings. They can use this. It will have a number of different dining venues in it. Families can use it. Patients, if they're healthy enough, can use it. It's just very intensive environment, therefore, for the patients, very specialized care. This is example, or this is a view of that terrace. The landscape here is done by field operations. So it's been a close collaboration with them. And finally, the street, where again, we pushed back. We had very little space to work, so we create this drop-off that steps back, creating a much smaller, welcoming environment for people to be dropped off, brings landscape to the street. Finally, a view from north. And that's where we are.